أخواتي إخواني، السلام عليكم جميعا. سامحوني، عندي برنامج صغير باش نعمله، باش نقدمه باش نفكوا مشكل من أمخاخ برشا ناس اللي هي مازالت حاجات أولوية ما همش فاهمينها. عندي فيديو اكتشفتها في اليوتيوب، هي عندها مدة موجودة وتدور في الانترنت، ومسجلها في الفيسبوك متاعي وفي ليزالبوم متاعي في جوجل، ومبارطاجي فيها، لكن ما هي عندهاش صدى اللازم. هي نقدمها الفيديو للأخوان والأخوات باش تفهموا شنية بالضبط. في سنوات 1994 94 هي معمولة في 94. وين معمولة؟ لا في تونس، لا في الجزائر، لا في سوريا، لا في الدول اللي واقع فيها مشاكل الإخوان. معمولة في أمريكا ومسجل عليها في الإكران، موجودة البلاد اللي تسجلت عليها، وسجلها واحد أمريكاني ضد الإمبريالية الأمريكانية، وهي بالإنجليزية. هي توا الفيديو هذه بالإنجليزية لا محل. اللي عنده الإنجليزية أعطاه ربي باش يفهمها ويتبعها بالكدا، لكن هي بسيطة، تدوم ساعة. التيتر متاعها كما قلنا بالإنجليزية، عاملها واحد غاضب على الأمريكان الاستعماريين الإمبرياليين باش يكشف سر الإخوان المسلمين، يعني الوهابيين اللي كسروا الدول معناها كاملة، من تونس إلى مصر إلى سوريا. عاد سوريا هذيك الضحية الكبيرة. يقدم في شكون؟ يقدم في مسؤولين وهابيين قادة معروفين في العالم العربي الكل، اللي يحاولوا باش يكسروا بلدانهم أي طريقة. تونس، الجزائر، مصر، سوريا، ما خلوش بلاد يعني، أوطانهم يعني هما اللي دخلوا فيهم الدخيل. واحد موجودين في الفيديو هذه. أنا حبيت أقدمها باش تاخذ صدى، باش الناس تكشف حاجة ونحيوا من أمخاخهم اللي الإخوان الوهابيين، الإخوان المسلمين الوهابيين، ينحيوا مخاخهم فكرة اللي هما وطنيين ويحبوا يعملوا دولة وطنية ويحبوا بلادهم إلى آخره. أو بالصوت والصورة بالاسم وكل شيء موجود في الفيديو. تبعوها دقيقة برك، خاطر هي بالإنجليزية، اللي ما يعرفش الإنجليزية ثم الصور والأسامي، توا تشوفوهم شكونهم وتوا تكشفوا يعني حقيقة. واللي مازال موش ثابت عليها توا مخه يدور المخ معاه. أنا كي قريت الفيديو هذيك بدلت لي مسار حياتي يعني أفكاري ونظرتي للدنيا تبدلوا، ما عادش كما كنت. اسمها بالإنجليزية باش نترجم لكم أنا حويجة، اسمها The CIA Controls القاعدة. يعني جهاز الأمن الأمريكاني CIA هو الجاري اللي يعمل في جستيون، هو اللي يتحكم في القاعدة يعني من وقت اللي قاعدة الظواهر وبن لادن وجماعة الكل هذوكم خلقتهم أمريكا. CIA معناتها CIA معناها إسرائيل، خاطر أمريكا هي تحت نفوذ المال الإسرائيلي اللي يسميهم هذوما ليليت، لي موندياليست أمريكان، هذوما لي جران كابيتاليست أمريكان اللي عندهم المال والبنوك. دونك هي اسمها The CIA Controls القاعدة. موجود يعني التيتر تاع الفيديو، وشكون عملها؟ موجود الأمريكاني اللي عملها. وتوا تشوفوها الفيديو، مش نعديها لكم أنا بعد التقديم هذا، مش نحطها في الفيلم. تبعوها دقيقة، مش لازم أنا ما تفهموش الأمريكان، تفهموا تصاور، تفهموا كل شيء، خاطر تعرفوهم تصوروا تاع ولاد بلادنا، ولاد بلاد تونس والجزائر، وفيهم القرضاوي هو الأول صورة اسم، الغنوشي موجود، ولابسين كومبا، لابسين كومبا وعاملين الحي، وتوا تشوفوهم بعينيكم. والجزائريين اللي حبوا يقلبوا الجزائر في التسعينيات وبحذاهم الغنوشي مشى يعاون فيهم وفشلوا، والكل بتصاور. انا عملت لهم البوم، ما خرجتهم التصاور هذوما الكل، عملت لهم كابتور ديكران وحطيتهم في الفيسبوك نتاعي ونبارطاجي فيهم. لكن جاتني الفكره باش نقدمها، يعني باش الناس معناتها تتاكد اون فوا بور توت، مره واحده، اللي هالاخوان المسلمين هذوما اللي انا نسميهم لي فaux frères musulmans mercenaires de la CIA et du Mossad et d'Israël. هما هذوكم يعني يخدموا عندهم، ولليوم يخدموا عندهم، والامريكان مش مسلم فيهم وعنده علاقات باهيه ويعاون فيهم وعطيهم معناها امتيازات وعطاهم فلوس. قطر ساهمت في الفلوس، وكلينتون تدخلت باش مولوهم وهزوا معناها الجهاديين التوانسه بدينار، يعني خلصوهم، اللي يمشي معاهم ياخذ دينار. هذا معناها شيء غريب وعظيم. ولليوم واصله راهي الحكايه، راهي لليوم امريكا تعاون فيهم، والصهاينه يعاونوا فيهم، اسرائيل تعاون فيهم. وشنو هو التطبيع هذا؟ وتعرفوا هذا كل شيء. على كل حال ما نطولش عليكم، تبعوا دقيقه ولا ما تفهموش، تو تلقاهم بالكومبا ميليتير، الغنوشي والقرضاوي وعزاب والجماعه الكل تلقاهم لابسين كومبا وبالاسم والصوره واضحه على الاسم، يعني على الاسم يكتب لك اسمه شكون هو وظاهر هو شكون هو بصورته بكل شيء. وسامحوني اتوا نحط الفيديو هذيا.
In 1994, PBS aired a documentary called Terrorists Among Us, Jihad in America. Steve Emerson produced and narrated the documentary. As the title suggests, the documentary was about a group of Islamic terrorists who had taken up residency in America. By the late 80s, early 90s, there were quite a few radical Islamic terrorists who were living in America and who were trying to convince their followers to wage jihad. Throughout his documentary, Emerson shows a bunch of these Islamic radicals speaking at various locations throughout America, as you can see.
In 1989, some of the world's most influential leaders of radical Islam held a conference attended by Sheikh Mohammed Siam, a leader of Hamas from Palestine; Abdullah Anas, a leader of the Algerian Islamic Front; Rashid Ghannouchi, head of the radical Tunisian fundamentalist group called Al-Nada; Tawfiq Mustafa, a leader of the Muslim Liberation Party based in Jordan; Yusuf al-Qaradawi, a militant Muslim leader originally from Egypt. This conference was never intended to be broadcast. It was a secret gathering to expand jihad networks and terrorist operations. Actual Hamas terrorists, veiled to protect their identities, boasted of their successful executions.
16 Jewish soldiers were killed.
But this gathering did not take place in the Middle East. It happened in the heartland of America, Kansas City, Missouri. All of these groups have established bases in the United States and have many graduates. We have documented at least a dozen similar conferences that have taken place in America in the past 5 years, where militant leaders from around the world have praised acts of terrorism and urged their followers to wage jihad.
What is amazing is that these foreign terrorist leaders decided to come to America and hold a terrorism conference. And not just one conference. They held at least 12 conferences. I mean, how stupid is the CIA if they can't even figure out that all these terrorist leaders have come to America to hold a terrorism conference, Not once, not twice, but 12 times. And how crazy were those terrorist leaders to hold terrorism conferences in the middle of America? Logically, the only reason they would have been willing to hold 12 terrorism conferences in America is because they felt the U.S. government was their ally. Of course, this begs the question, why did those terrorists believe that the U.S. government was their ally? To answer this question, Emerson provides a little background information.
The trail began 15 years ago with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Hoping to halt the spread of communism, the United States actively backed the Mujahideen, Afghanistan's Islamic rebels dedicated to spreading jihad. The CIA channeled almost $3 billion to the Mujahideen through the intelligence service of neighboring Pakistan.
In other words, those Islamic terrorists, they were our allies. They helped us remove the Soviets from Afghanistan.
Charles Kogan helped run the operation for the CIA.
As far as the U.S. side of it was concerned, this was an agency operation. The training was carried out by the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate at camps along the border and in the interior of Pakistan, too. I would say that over the sweep of the Cold War, this was the most successful covert action that the U.S. engaged in. This was a very remarkable event. The Soviet Union had invaded a country which was not within their orbit, and they were forced to withdraw from it. And this was a clear reversal of communism.
At one point in his video, Emerson describes the people who were receiving CIA money.
Pakistan was funneling more and more of the CIA's money to the most radical Afghan Muslims. In the end, they would contribute to the expansion of jihad around the world.
Emerson makes it sound like the CIA was just giving Pakistan a bunch of money and letting them decide which Afghans to give the money to. But that's not the way Kogan described what happened. Kogan claimed that the CIA ran the operation. Remember, he referred to the operation as an agency operation. The agency is short for the Central Intelligence Agency. You can bet that they knew exactly who was getting their money, and that they supported giving American money to the most radical Afghan Muslims. What's more, the CIA wanted those terrorists to expand their jihad around the world. They had created an army of radical Muslims. They wanted to use them, not only in Afghanistan, but in other countries as well. Of course, the CIA denies this. But as you will see, there is overwhelming evidence that this is in fact what they did. After talking about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Emerson goes on to briefly talk about the Iranian Revolution and the assassination of Anwar Sadat, the former president of Egypt. He then goes on to talk about Abdullah Azzam.
It was in this environment that Sheikh Abdullah Azzam rose to prominence. Born in Palestine, Azzam fought against Israel and against Arab regimes he believed were puppets of the West. In the early 1980s, Azzam went to Peshawar, Pakistan, to set up a support network for the Holy Warriors. The American headquarters was called the Al-Kifaq Refugee Center, but when translated, the Arabic on their own letterhead reads, the Office of Services to the Holy Warriors. It provided money, weapons, and most important, recruited thousands of Muslim fighters from outside Afghanistan. Azzam helped transform the war against the Soviets into a full-blown international jihad, or holy war.
In his documentary, Emerson never explicitly says that the CIA worked with Abdullah Azzam and his Al-Kifaq Refugee Center to oust the Soviets from Afghanistan. However, he did say that the Al-Kifaq Refugee Center had offices in America. And he did interview a CIA official who said that the operation to oust the Soviets from Afghanistan was run by the CIA. As such, I think it's fair to say that the CIA was working with Abdullah Azzam and his Al-Kifaq Refugee Center. In fact, I have proof of this, which I will show you later on. The reason why Emerson is ambiguous about the relationship between the CIA and the Al-Kifaq Refugee Center is because he does not want his viewers to have the impression that the CIA controlled the Al-Kifaq Refugee Center, even though it did. And you will understand shortly why Emerson concealed this fact.
From the Al-Kifaq Refugee Center in Brooklyn, Abdullah Azzam and others would go around the country raising money and preaching holy war.
That's actually not the Al-Khifa Refugee Center. That's actually Masjid al-Farouk. In Arabic, the word masjid means mosque, and the word al means the. So when translated to English, the phrase Masjid al-Farouk means the Farouk Mosque. At one point, the Al-Khifa Refugee Center was located inside that mosque. Incidentally, the Al-Khifa Refugee Center inside that mosque was not the only one in America.
The Al-Khifa Refugee Center set up an elaborate support and recruiting network coast to coast, with branches in more than 38 American cities.
You would think that the Al-Khifa Refugee Center would not have been able to set up offices in 38 U.S. cities without the knowledge and approval of the U.S. government. As for the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn, at its height it collected funds for Afghan war refugees, and it sent as many as 200 young fervent Arab immigrants to Pakistan and then Afghanistan to fight. There were several groups of rebels fighting the Russians in Afghanistan. One of these groups was led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. Many of the recruits from the Al-Khifa Refugee Center joined the group led by Hekmatyar. Despite the militant anti-Western stance of their leader, Mr. Hekmatyar's forces received more U.S. government money than any rebel group. This shows you two things. First, if someone has an anti-Western appearance, that does not necessarily mean that that person is actually working against the West. They could just be taking on an anti-Western appearance in order to boost their appeal. Second, this provides further evidence that the Al-Khifa Refugee Center was in fact a CIA operation. If Hekmatyar was the CIA's #1 guy in Afghanistan, and the Al-Khifa Refugee Center was sending him recruits, isn't it likely that the Al-Khifa Refugee Center was also a CIA operation? And in fact, according to Newsweek, the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn was run by the CIA. This is how they described it. The diaspora of young Arab men willing to die for Allah congregated at the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn, New York, a dreary inner-city building that doubled as a recruiting post for the CIA. Furthermore, Newsweek says that the CIA provided passports to many of the Mujahideen so they could come to the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn after the war. This CIA document shows that Azam met with Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. Azam knew bin Laden's family, and that bin Laden had significant sums of disposable income. Azam convinced bin Laden that he, bin Laden, had the ability to create a network that could significantly enhance Mujahideen abilities to recruit fighters and obtain contributions from around the Islamic world for the war effort. Shortly thereafter, bin Laden joined Azam in Peshawar, and they formed the Maktab al-Khidmat. In English, the phrase Maktab al-Khidmat means the Office of Services. Instead of saying the full name of Azam's organization, the Office of Services to the Holy Warriors, people often shorten the name to the Office of Services, or Maktab al-Khidmat in Arabic. The important thing to note here is that the organization referenced in this CIA document is the same organization that Stephen Emerson is talking about. And remember that this organization is also known as the Al-Khifa Refugee Center. We can probably forgive Emerson for not mentioning that Osama bin Laden co-founded the Al-Khifa Refugee Center, as this video was aired in 1994, before most people knew who Osama bin Laden was. But the history of bin Laden in Afghanistan is important. To further understand this history, let's now take a look at a book written by Ahmed Rashid. The book is called Taliban. The book, of course, deals with the history of the Taliban. The book has been translated into 22 different languages. 1,500,000 copies of the book have been sold worldwide. The book is assigned reading in 200 universities throughout America and Britain. Chapter 10 of the book is called Global Jihad, the Arab Afghans and Osama bin Laden. The chapter contains the history of what Osama bin Laden did in Afghanistan during the 80s. Osama bin Laden went to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. He is the son of Mohammed bin Laden, a Yemeni who emigrated to Saudi Arabia. While living in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Laden founded a construction company, which is today known as the Saudi bin Laden Group, the largest construction company in the world. Mohammed bin Laden was a close friend of the late King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. Apparently, being friends with the Saudi royal family has its benefits. Bin Laden was able to become fabulously wealthy on the contract to renovate and expand the holy mosques of Mecca and Medina. His son, Osama bin Laden, played an important role in the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan. He led the Saudi contingent in Afghanistan. Pakistani intelligence wanted a Saudi royal prince to lead the Saudi contingent in Afghanistan. But no pampered Saudi prince was ready to rough it out in the Afghan mountains. Bin Laden, although not a royal, was close enough to the royals and certainly wealthy enough to lead the Saudi contingent. The fact that his family ran the largest construction company in the world came in handy. He was able to use personnel and equipment from the Saudi Bin Laden group to build roads and depots for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. In 1986, he helped build the Coast Tunnel Complex, which the CIA was funding as a major arms storage depot, training facility, and medical center for the Mujahideen. Osama bin Laden once told Ahmed Rashid that volunteers were trained by Pakistani and American officers at his training camps. He also told Rashid that the weapons were supplied by the Americans, the money by the Saudis. I mentioned these stories of CIA collaboration with Osama bin Laden because I have sometimes heard people falsely argue that the actions of Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan were somehow separate or independent from the actions of the CIA. These stories show that Osama bin Laden was in fact working closely with the CIA to defeat the Soviets. In addition to not liking the Soviets, apparently, Abdullah Azzam didn't like America either.
The world today is arbitrarily ruled by Jews and Christians. The Americans, the British, and others. And behind them, the fingers of international Jewry with their wealth and their women and their media.
Abdullah Azzam was the keynote speaker at what was called the First Conference of Jihad, held not in the Middle East, but in Brooklyn, New York. Azzam instructed his audience to wage jihad wherever they were, even in America.
The jihad, the fighting, is obligatory on you wherever you can perform it. And just as when you are in America you must fast unless you are ill or on a voyage, so too must you wage jihad.
As you can see from the video, Emerson is showing Masjid al-Farouk as the place where the first conference of jihad took place. The CIA knew about what was going on at the mosque and must have had it under surveillance. Perhaps the CIA didn't like what Azzam said about jihad in America because the following year he was killed. The killers have still not been identified, which in my mind makes it likely that they were working for a Western government. The death of Azzam, however, did not end the Al-Khifa Refugee Center, though it did result in a name change. According to Rashid, after the Soviets left Afghanistan, the Maktab would emerge at the center of a web of radical organizations that helped carry out the World Trade Center bombing and the bombings of the U.S. embassies in Africa in 1998. In other words, the Office of Services, otherwise known as the Al-Khifa Refugee Center, became Al-Qaeda. Rashid explains the name change on page 132 of his book. After the death of Azzam in 1989, Osama bin Laden took over Azzam's organization and set up Al-Qaeda, or military base, as a service center for Arab Afghans and their families. Emerson never says that the Al-Khifa Refugee Center became Al-Qaeda. Again, we can forgive him for this, as the video was published in 1994, and nobody had heard of Al-Qaeda at this time. Emerson does, however, talk about the expansion of jihad from Afghanistan to other places.
Now, the enemy was no longer just the communists, but Jews, Christians, and moderate Muslims, who they accused of being part of a conspiracy to defeat Islam. Islamic holy warriors began launching terror attacks against Israel, Egypt, and Algeria. The militants' rage was not limited to their enemies in the Middle East. Increasingly, the Islamic holy warriors focused their anger on the West, especially America.
Emerson talked to an FBI agent about this worldwide terrorist network that the CIA spawned.
What is unique is the international nature, the connection all the way from North America, Europe, the Middle East, Pakistan, Afghanistan, over into Southeast Asia. It is much more global than any type of terrorist network that we've had to deal with in the past.
I find it hard to believe that these Islamic fundamentalists can sustain this network without outside support. Given that the CIA created these fundamentalists in the first place, it seems only logical that they maintain control of them after the war in Afghanistan. While the CIA takes credit for running the operation to remove the Soviets from Afghanistan, they seem to have a hard time explaining what came next. I'm not exactly sure what the official CIA story is for what happened afterwards. But it seems like their story is that they just stopped everything and forgot that the Al-Khifa Refugee Center, now Al-Qaeda, had 38 branch offices in America. So after the war in Afghanistan, what happened to those 38 Al-Khifa Refugee Centers in America?
These centers became clearinghouses and recruiting offices to support jihad around the world.
If the CIA supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, isn't it reasonable to suspect that they supported them when they attacked other countries as well? Here's Charles Kogan trying to explain the actions of his former assets. Notice how nervous he is.
We had really very few illusions. That's not to say that we could have predicted that some of these Mujahideen might have turned against the U.S. or the West later on. But as I say, our focus was on hitting and hurting as much as possible the Soviet forces in Afghanistan. I don't think we have really anything to be apologetic about. These were the fighting assets, and we had to aid them. What came later, came later.
Why so nervous, Kogan? Is it because you worry that someone might discover the truth and refute your bullshit explanation?
Radicals conducted military exercises at shooting ranges and training camps in at least 9 U.S. locations, including this one in Connecticut. Groups of Islamic militants fired semi-automatic weapons and trained with explosives. According to FBI intelligence reports, groups would come every weekend and shoot 1,000 rounds a day into silhouette-shaped targets. One of the leaders was an Egyptian immigrant named Saeed Nosser.
You may be wondering why the FBI allowed those militants to reside in America and learn how to shoot things. And of course the answer is they needed to learn how to shoot before going to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. According to the New York Times, before the people recruited at the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn went to Afghanistan, the recruits received training in using rifles, assault weapons, and handguns. In this article, the Times specifically mentioned Saeed Nosser as having received this training. Court papers showed that he received weapons training during the summer of 1989 at the High Rock shooting range in Naugatuck, Connecticut.
In November 1990, Nosser was arrested for the murder of militant Rabbi Meir Kahane. Nosser was ultimately convicted of weapons charges, but unexpectedly, the jury acquitted him of the Kahane murder. His supporters were elated.
The judge called the verdict outrageous.
It was irrational almost in terms of the evidence that I saw at that trial. It made no sense, common or otherwise, to reach that verdict, particularly with the other verdicts that were reached. So I think it was outrageous.
Presumably, the U.S. government had the jury acquit Nosser because they wanted to embolden his comrades at the Al-Khifa Refugee Center, which was by now actually Al-Qaeda. The government wanted Al-Qaeda to believe that they still supported them, and the acquittal did embolden his comrades. They would soon bomb the World Trade Center. You may be wondering, if his comrades bombed the World Trade Center, shouldn't the government have known about the plot beforehand? Shouldn't the FBI have investigated his friends and had them under surveillance? Shouldn't the CIA have been watching them? These people were the same people the CIA used to oust the Soviets from Afghanistan. The CIA knew about them. Shouldn't they have been able to prevent them from attacking the World Trade Center? Of course, the FBI and the CIA could have prevented al-Qaeda from attacking the World Trade Center, but they didn't. And so one must conclude that the U.S. government wanted them to attack the World Trade Center.
Even though Nasser had ties to an international radical network, police never investigated the possibility of a larger conspiracy.
There was no indication at all of any conspiracy of a nature that has been spoken of. The facts indicate at this point it was a lone gunman who committed a homicide.
Nasser was brought to this holding cell in Lower Manhattan after his arrest. By then, detectives had searched his apartment and found 47 boxes full of personal possessions and papers. But investigators dismissed those papers as irrelevant religious materials. It was only after the bombing of the World Trade Center that law enforcement re-examined those papers and realized they had overlooked one of the largest collections of terrorist materials ever found in the United States. The papers included plans to blow up American skyscrapers. The documents would reveal that Nasser was at the heart of a worldwide terrorist network headquartered right here in the United States.
Unfortunately, we had that information. It was there, and we didn't see it.
Michael Cherkasky was the chief of investigations for the Manhattan District Attorney at the time of the bombing.
And looking back at it, there was enormous amounts of significant material in those boxes. Whether they were the precise plans, no, I don't think so, but were there very strong indications that this man and a group of compatriots were involved in terrorist activities which could ultimately lead to a disaster like the World Trade Center? The answer is yes. Only when we started looking at that material and we started finding things and seeing things clearly for the first time that we became agitated because, honestly, because we hadn't seen it before, and excited because, in fact, we now thought we had more of a clue about tracing the history of this group and more of an idea about what had actually happened here.
The FBI claims they did not examine the documents Nasser had until after the World Trade Center bombing. It is not credible to argue that law enforcement would not read the documents they seized from a murder suspect. And in fact, I have proof that law enforcement did read Nasser's documents right after they seized them. A little over a week after Nasser murdered Kahane, the New York Times ran a story called FBI Investigates Groups of Zealots Who Praise Kahane's Slaying. Let's read the first two paragraphs from that story. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is scrambling to investigate the Muslim groups associated with the Masjid al-Salam Mosque in Jersey City, where al-Said Nasser, the man accused of killing Rabbi Meir Kahane, worshipped, according to high-level law enforcement officials. Although the New York City police say they believe Mr. Nasser acted alone, one law enforcement official said the investigation into Rabbi Meir Kahane's death had opened a window into several radical fundamentalist groups. Besides looking at possible links between these groups and the shooting of Rabbi Kahane last week at a Manhattan hotel, the FBI fears that these groups may be capable of terrorist activities at a time of heightened tensions in the Middle East, the high-level officials said. A little over a week after the New York Times said the arrest of Nasser had opened a window to several extremist Islamic groups, the FBI publicly contradicted that story. There is no evidence that Mr. Nasser is linked to any Mideast terrorist organization, District Attorney Robert M. Morgenthau said in announcing the indictment. Given the story that the Times published a week ago, this statement is ridiculous. So why did he make it? Why does the FBI insist that they did not read Nasser's documents, when they obviously did? The CIA must have told the FBI to drop their investigation. The CIA did not want the FBI to destroy their terrorism network, which was now al-Qaeda. This article proves that the government read Nasser's documents soon after the Kahane murder. The New York Times published this article about a month after the murder. If you look at the bottom of page 1 of this article, you will see Nasser's home also contained literature relating to guns, weapons and combat, including subjects such as bomb-making, hand grenades, security and listening devices, arms in Afghanistan, explosive traps, how to teach yourself to shoot like an expert, the 9 don'ts of fighting discipline, and a guide to buying guns and ammunition. There were also files of articles about the assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and the attempt on Zaki Badr, the Egyptian Interior Minister. Clearly, these documents are not irrelevant religious material. Clearly, the FBI did examine the documents Nasser had in his apartment when he murdered Kahane. Or how else did the New York Times get a list of those documents? Is the FBI claiming that, hey, we did not look at these documents, but the New York Times did, and we don't read the New York Times, so we did not know that Nasser had this material. And notice that one document was called Arms in Afghanistan. Presumably, Nasser was given this document because he was involved in the war to oust the Soviets from Afghanistan. Again, that effort was run by the CIA. The fact that he had that document while living in America tends to show that he was working with the CIA. Now let's see what Emerson claims was in those boxes.
The boxes included formulas for bomb making, detailed instructions on attacking aircraft, assassination targets, and even classified U.S. military documents.
Presumably, the CIA gave him those classified U.S. military documents. Perhaps Arms in Afghanistan was one of those classified U.S. military documents. Again, the war to oust the Soviets from Afghanistan was a CIA operation. The fact that Nasser had these documents implies that he was working with the CIA to remove the Soviets from Afghanistan. Amazingly, Nasser continued to work for Al-Qaeda while he was in prison, and the U.S. government let him. This proves that our government wanted Nasser to carry out his acts of terrorism.
From his prison cell, Nasser continued to organize the campaign of terror. Prison logs show that he met with several of the conspirators to help plan the World Trade Center bombing.
So after not stopping Nasser from killing Kahane, the government allows him to organize the attack on the World Trade Center from jail. Somehow, the prison, which should be monitoring his communications with the outside world, just missed that part.
He was a soldier when he shot Kahane, and in some ways his status was elevated to be a soldier, a trainer, an example, a martyr for the movement, who was allegedly continually demanding that the movement move forward, that they take more strident action, that he was sitting in jail for what he had done, and that others had to pick up the mantle.
So while Nasser is urging his followers to kill more people, the prison officials, who should be monitoring these conversations, are doing what? Apparently, they were monitoring these conversations because the FBI did indeed have Mohammed Salameh under surveillance before he attacked the World Trade Center. The FBI began monitoring him after he visited al-Said Nasser in prison. The FBI sought to electronically eavesdrop on conversations in prison between al-Said Nasser, who was serving time in Attica State Prison in connection with the slaying of Rabbi Kahane, and Mohammed Salameh. Whether tape recordings were made was something officials refused to confirm yesterday. The FBI probably didn't want to acknowledge the existence of the tapes because Nasser and Salameh probably discussed the attack on the World Trade Center. If the FBI said they had tapes which suggested that Salameh was going to bomb the World Trade Center, people would wonder why the FBI didn't stop the attack. Of course, the mere fact that the FBI had Salameh under surveillance before the attack shows that the FBI knew the attack was coming. And Salameh wasn't the only World Trade Center bomber who visited Nasser in jail. Many of the suspects were also fervent supporters of al-Said Nasser. They showed up at Mr. Nasser's trial and have visited him at Attica State Prison. You would think that the FBI would be monitoring these people. And indeed they were. 5 months before the World Trade Center bombing, about 20 members of the 2 mosques in Brooklyn and Jersey City, where several Trade Center suspects worshipped, were subpoenaed to appear before a federal grand jury. The subpoenas, issued to people who had visited al-Said Nasser in prison or attended his trial, indicates that federal agents had been pressing harder than was previously known to make inroads into the small emigre world from which the Trade Center suspects came. Actually, FBI surveillance of the terrorists goes back much further than that. The FBI had photographed the terrorists in 1989, 4 years before the bombing of the World Trade Center. James P. Fogel, an FBI agent, said he photographed several suspects as they came in and out of a mosque at 552 Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn on July 2, 1989. The mosque at that address is Masjid al-Farouk. He and other agents then followed the men as they drove to the Calverton shooting range near Riverhead, Long Island, where Mr. Fogel photographed them firing what he said were AK-47 assault rifles and 9mm semi-automatic pistols at targets. Obviously, the government wanted to keep tabs on their assets. And not only did the FBI have the terrorists under surveillance before the bombing, they also had an informer who had infiltrated the group. Court papers filed in connection with the World Trade Center bombing say for the first time that a confidential informer provided information to investigators about the activities of Mohammed A. Salameh, the first suspect arrested in the February 26th explosion. The informer was said to have helped Mr. Salameh learn to drive a van approximately 2 days before the World Trade Center explosion. The informant, Imad A. Salam, was working for the Federal Bureau of Investigation since at least November 1991. The revelation that Mr. Salam was in contact with the federal government that long ago raises new questions about why the FBI was unaware of the plot to bomb the World Trade Center on February 26th. Amazingly, Imad Salam apparently taped the conversations he had with his FBI handlers. And in those tapes, you can hear Salam say that he warned the FBI of the World Trade Center bombing before it happened. And you can hear the FBI agent apparently agreeing with Salam.
Correspondent Jacqueline Adams has the story.
FBI agents might have been able to prevent last February's deadly explosion at New York's World Trade Center. They discussed secretly substituting harmless powder for the explosives, but they didn't, according to the FBI's own informant, Imad Salam. Unbeknownst to the FBI at the time, Salam recorded many of his conversations with his handlers. In one, Salam complains to an FBI agent, "Since the bomb went off, I feel terrible. I feel bad. I feel here is people who don't listen." The agent replies, "Hey, I mean, it wasn't like you didn't try and I didn't try. You can't force people to do the right thing."
At another point in their conversation, Salam said, "You were informed. Everything is ready. The day and the time. Boom. Lock them up and that's that. That's why I feel so bad." Other people confirmed that Salam had warned the FBI in advance. Barbara Rogers, the former wife of the informer Imad Salam, said the day after the explosion, Mr. Salam was upset and told her the bombing could have been averted if the FBI had heeded his warnings. He had told the agency that several buildings had been targeted, she said, and he gave them names of several men, including Mahmoud Abu Halima and Ibrahim Al-Ghabrani, who were later arrested in the case. One of those two men, Mahmoud Abu Halima, was convicted of bombing the World Trade Center and was sentenced to 240 years in prison. The story of his life is pretty interesting. Mahmoud Abu Halima was one of the people recruited at the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn. He was known as one of the committed. Several times, his acquaintances say, he left his home to go fight for months at a time, with the rebels trying to topple the Soviet-installed government in Afghanistan. Abu Halima came to America on October 4th, 1986, with a German passport and a tourist visa. According to the New York Times, he overstayed his visa by 5 years, and it was not clear how he left and re-entered the country to go to Pakistan. Not clear how he left and re-entered the country? Let me guess. The CIA told immigration to give him a special exemption to enter and leave the country. While living in America, he worked as a cab driver. Nevertheless, Abu Halima became a permanent resident under a special exemption in the 1986 Immigration Reform Act, under which he claimed an exemption as an agricultural worker. How did Abu Halima get an exemption as an agricultural worker when he was a cab driver who overstayed his tourist visa by 5 years? Let me take another guess. Same answer. The CIA told immigration to make him a permanent resident. So the guy who the CIA presumably helped enter and leave the country on multiple occasions, using a tourist visa for 5 years too long, which allowed him to obtain permanent residency under a special exemption for agricultural workers when he was really a cab driver. That guy helped detonate a bomb at the World Trade Center. And the CIA didn't know about it? I don't think so. Not only did the U.S. government know about the World Trade Center terrorist network in Brooklyn, the Egyptian government also knew about that terrorist network. And they warned us about that terrorist network before the bombing. President Hosni Mubarak of Egypt said today that America could have prevented the bombing of the World Trade Center if American officials had heeded his warnings about an Islamic fundamentalist network in the United States. You may be asking yourself, why did the CIA have Al-Qaeda detonate a bomb inside the World Trade Center? There were several reasons. Here's one. The CIA used the bombing as an excuse to lash out at other governments. Throughout the investigation, the New York Times would hint at foreign involvement in the plot. Presumably, whenever the CIA wanted an excuse to lash out at this or that government, they would leak a story to the New York Times which hinted at that country's involvement in the bombing. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, however, the government told the Times that there was no foreign involvement. More and more, one leading law enforcement official said, the bombing is seen as an act by ill-trained New York area plotters operating independently and without direct orders from a foreign government or international terrorist network. But he cautioned that this view could change as the investigation progressed. The New York Times printed this article on March 26th. A month later, the New York Times was singing a different tune. On April 25th, the Times said, signs are mounting that the attack was part of a wide conspiracy that involved huge payments from abroad. The U.S. government traced this money to Iran and Germany. This case has some fascinating turns coming up in it, said one law enforcement official. There's some real surprises in there. It'll be a bigger show before it's over. One of the countries we apparently wanted to pressure was Iraq. Shortly after the attack, the New York Times reported that Ramzi Youssef, the person who organized the attack, had Iraqi parents, which suggested that Iraq might somehow be involved in the attack. Investigators are examining whether the World Trade Center bombing could have some relation to Iraq. Their interest was sparked by a missing Iraqi, Ramzi Ahmed Youssef, who came to America last September on a flight from Pakistan and disappeared after the bombing. However, the information about Youssef's parents seems not to be true. In fact, the consensus now seems to be that his parents were Pakistani. But presumably, the U.S. government lied about his parents so they could implicate Iraq in the bombing. And there was another apparent connection to Iraq. According to the New York Times, the FBI claimed that two brothers who gave crucial information about the bombing may have fled to Iraq. Presumably, the U.S. government sent those informers to Iraq so they would have an excuse to pressure the Iraqi government. And after the bombing, in their comments to the New York Times, government officials did imply that Iraq was behind the bombing. The fact that both suspects are believed to have fled to Iraq has intrigued investigators who are trying to determine whether a foreign government was behind the attack. One of the brothers who fled to Iraq was Abdul Rahman Yassin. He had been questioned by the FBI and released almost immediately after the bombing of the World Trade Center. Apparently, releasing him wasn't such a great idea, because on August 4th, the government indicted him in connection with the attack. The government accused him of helping to mix explosive chemicals in the month leading up to the bombing. The lawyers for the other suspects were incredulous that the government had allowed Yassin to leave the country. The issue is, why was he allowed to go, considering the information they had after the bombing, said one of the lawyers for the defense. They knew he would go to a country with no relations with the United States, making his return an impossibility. That man knew more than anybody, and that's the man they allowed to leave. Not too long after the bombing, the neocons began blaming Iraq. Lori Milroy led the charge. She wrote a series of articles and books about the connection between Saddam Hussein and the terrorists behind the World Trade Center bombing. Not surprisingly, former CIA Director James Woolsey was a big supporter of Milroy. He wrote the foreword for one of her books. The subtitle of that book was The First World Trade Center Attack and Saddam Hussein's War Against America. In the foreword, Woolsey called the book brave and lucid. Regardless of whether Yusuf was Iraqi or Pakistani, he was certainly an asset of Western intelligence agencies. I won't say that he was solely an asset of the CIA, however, because he was apparently educated in Britain, which implies that he was actually their asset to begin with. In any event, in the wake of the bombing, we showed everyone that Yusuf was working for us. Why else would we bungle the effort to arrest him? We bungled the search for Yusuf in several ways. To begin with, our government failed to offer a reward for his capture in the immediate aftermath of the bombing. The State Department and the FBI engaged in a game of kabuki. The State Department blamed the FBI for not offering the reward. A State Department spokesman, Michael McCurry, acknowledged that the department had denied a request by the FBI in early April for the State Department to provide a substantial reward in the case. Another State Department official said the department had since made plain that it believed the FBI should provide the reward, and that it had the money to do so. So, in other words, the FBI said the State Department should pony up the money for the reward. The State Department said the FBI should come up with the money. And while both sides blamed each other, nothing got done. Rather than bureaucratic incompetence, this was bureaucratic kabuki, the purpose of which was to allow Yusuf to remain free. In fact, one congressman essentially admitted that the whole thing was kabuki, and that the government did not want to offer a reward. Representative Olympia J. Snow, Republican of Maine, said they could solve it if they really wanted to. And because the U.S. government failed to promptly offer a reward for the capture of Yusuf, American officials say privately that they feared the United States may have squandered a crucial chance to track down Mr. Yusuf before he disappeared in the Middle East. In fact, refusing to set a reward for Yusuf's capture was not the only thing the government screwed up. After he was first identified as a suspect in the case on March 31st, FBI officials said they would move swiftly to add him to its most wanted list. But it was not until April 19th that the FBI could decide whose place on that list Mr. Yusuf should take. And here's another reason why we had Al-Qaeda bomb the World Trade Center. We wanted an excuse to demand that Pakistan crack down on an air route which was used to smuggle in undocumented aliens. Two of the bombers, Ahmed Ajaj and Ramzi Youssef, used this air route to travel to America. According to the New York Times, this air route had become so notorious for bringing undocumented aliens into New York that American officials said they suspected official Pakistani complicity. Of course, after it was learned that those two terrorists used that air route, the American government proceeded to threaten the Pakistani government, and the Pakistani government took action. Their action produced a sharp drop in the numbers of inadmissible aliens disembarking from Pakistani International Airlines flights in April, and so far this month. We've seen a dramatic turnaround, a dramatic improvement, said one U.S. official. And here's the final reason why we had Al-Qaeda bomb the World Trade Center. We needed an excuse to make those Muslims our enemy. Until the bombing, those Muslims were our friends. They helped us defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan. But after the Soviets left, we did not want them to be our allies anymore. The last thing the West wants to do is to ally itself with Muslims. So we needed an excuse to make them our enemy. The bombing did that. To be more precise, the bombing started that process. We needed to use those Islamic extremists for a while longer, particularly the ones in Brooklyn. We needed them to help us attack Egypt. At this time, Egypt was participating in the negotiations between Israel and Palestine. Egypt has always played a role in the negotiations between those two countries, and they did so again in 1993. In April of that year, for example, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak met with Yasser Arafat in order to restart the negotiations. We had Al-Qaeda attack Egypt because they were on the other side of the negotiations. Egypt was on the side of Palestine. We were on the side of Israel. And we wanted to force Egypt into supporting the agreement Israel wanted. So we had our Islamic extremists attack Egypt. An attack they did. They nearly overthrew the Egyptian government. Egypt was making its own threats. According to the New York Times, Hosni Mubarak said that unless peace can be established between the Palestinians and the Israelis, further regional conflicts will erupt. That sounds to me like Mubarak was threatening to start a war, unless the negotiations turned out the way he wanted. For proof that America wanted Egypt to act in a certain way during the negotiations, consider what this observer said. Egypt has to prove to the United States that it's a key player, Mohammed Sid Ahmed, a political commentator, said. The Americans are questioning now whether their investment in Egypt is reaping fruits in terms of stability. One way to exhibit a quick performance is on the peace talks. So who did we use to attack Egypt? We had a group of terrorists called the Islamic Group, attack the Egyptian tourism industry. These attacks had a devastating impact on the Egyptian economy, as tourists stopped coming to Egypt. By some estimates, up to 60% of tourist reservations have been cancelled nationwide. Tourism is a critical part of the Egyptian economy. The New York Times called the tourism industry Egypt's most important source of revenue. Don't believe me that the CIA controlled the Islamic Group? Then consider this. According to Ahmed Rashid, the bombings carried out in Egypt by Islamic groups were also traced back to Egyptian veterans trained in Afghanistan. Remember, in Afghanistan, those militants participated in a CIA operation. So if later on those militants attacked Egypt, isn't it reasonable to think that the CIA had them do it? Still don't believe that the CIA controlled the Islamic group? Then how do you explain the fact that their leader, Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, led the group from Brooklyn? According to the New York Times, Sheikh Rahman had a group of followers in Egypt, known as the Islamic Group, which conducted a series of killings, both in Egypt and the United States, including the recent attacks against foreign tourists in Egypt. He is the same person that Emerson and the FBI accused of orchestrating the assassination of America Hane and the bombing of the World Trade Center.
That in fact it was a long-term conspiracy that had been hatched by Sheikh Rahman.
Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, leader of a militant Egyptian movement, came to the United States in 1990. He would soon assert control over the jihad movement in the U.S. The killing of Kahana was the first act of terrorism planned and carried out by Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman's foot soldiers.
Omar Abdul Rahman was accused in Egypt of enticing people to kill Sadat. He got away with it. He came here. I heard him myself talking about jihad, and I heard him and I understand how he could convince people in the way of jihad, in the wrong meaning of the word jihad.
Sheikh Rahman came to the U.S. in the summer of 1990. Immediately after arriving in America, Sheikh Abdel Rahman was invited to be the Imam of Masjid al-Farouk. Remember, Masjid al-Farouk was the home of the Al-Khifa Refugee Center. And so when Sheikh Rahman became the Imam of Masjid al-Farouk, he also became the head of the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn. Basically, he took up where Abdul Azam left off.
Sheikh Abdul Rahman actively recruited followers across the country.
Like Abdullah Azam, Sheikh Rahman recruited fighters for the war in Afghanistan, at least initially.
The obligation of Allah is upon us to wage jihad for the sake of Allah. It is one of the obligations which we must undoubtedly fulfill. And we conquer the lands of the infidels, and we spread Islam by calling the infidels to Allah. And if they stand in our way, then we wage jihad for the sake of Allah.
Sheikh Rahman had a close relationship with Mr. Hekmatyar. Remember that out of all the rebel groups in Afghanistan, the CIA gave the most money to the group led by Hekmatyar. So if Sheikh Rahman was close to Hekmatyar, he was also probably close to the CIA. Sheikh Rahman came to America about a half year after Abdullah Azam was assassinated. It looks like the CIA brought Sheikh Rahman to America so he could replace Abdullah Azam as the leader of the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn. Apparently, the CIA wanted a high-profile extremist to replace Abdullah Azzam. And remember that Sheikh Rahman became famous for ordering the death of Anwar Sadat, the former president of Egypt. This is the guy the CIA recruited to replace Abdullah Azzam. Assuming Sheikh Rahman really was a CIA asset, that means the CIA was probably responsible for the death of Sadat. Actually, there was another person who ran the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn, alongside of Sheikh Rahman. His name was Mustafa Shalaby. He did not get along with Sheikh Rahman. The Sheikh and Mr. Shalaby had a power struggle over control of the Mujahideen fundraising group, according to acquaintances of the two men, with the Sheikh trying to use the funds for his own efforts to promote Islamic revolution in Egypt against the Mubarak government. Mr. Shalaby was found murdered in his Seagate home in March 1991. No one has ever been prosecuted for killing Shalaby. Most likely, Rahman had him killed, and the government did not prosecute him because they wanted him to kill Shalaby. They wanted to shift the focus of Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan to Egypt. By this time, the Russians had left Afghanistan, and so now was the time to go after Egypt. In fact, this is probably why Abdullah Azzam was assassinated. He was focused on Afghanistan, but the CIA wanted to shift their focus to Egypt. Don't believe me that the CIA brought Sheikh Rahman into the U.S. to replace Abdullah Azzam? Then how do you explain how immigration handled the situation? On December 16, 1990, the New York Times told everyone that Sheikh Rahman was living in Brooklyn. This is the guy who was involved in the assassination of Sadat, and he was living in America. So what did the government do? Did they arrest him? No. Did they deport him? No. Is this suspicious? Yes. Actually, the government started off on the right foot. State Department officials revoked the Sheikh's visa on November 17th, after the FBI told them of the Sheikh's presence. After revoking his tourist visa, instead of deporting him, the Immigration and Naturalization Service Office in Newark mistakenly granted Sheikh Rahman permanent resident status or a green card in April 1991. At some point after that, in 1991, Rahman left America to go overseas. When he returned in August, instead of refusing him entry, the U.S. allowed him in. Subsequently, U.S. immigration revoked his green card. And then he went to Canada towards the end of 1992. And then, when he tried to come back to America, you guessed it, immigration let him back in. If he went to Canada, they could have excluded him coming back in, said Charles Schumer. Here they spend all this time trying to get him out. He goes to Canada and gives them the perfect reason to exclude him, and they don't. It would certainly be illegal for him to come back in, said William R. Tillman, an immigration official. To depart the United States is in effect to abandon the application for admission. Incidentally, Canada should not have allowed him in either. The New York Times mocked immigration for allowing Rahman to enter and leave the country at will. With one eyeball missing entirely, and the other disfigured, the Sheikh is hardly difficult to recognize, said the Times. After looking at the way immigration handled Sheikh Rahman, there is only one reasonable conclusion. The government intentionally allowed him to enter and leave the country whenever he wanted. No other explanation makes sense. Remember, this is the guy who was involved in the assassination of Sadat. This is the guy who was telling his followers to blow up things in Egypt. The fact that our government had allowed Sheikh Rahman to live in Brooklyn had not gone unnoticed in Egypt. Remember, Egypt had warned us that members of the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn would bomb the World Trade Center. And they were happy to point out that Sheikh Rahman led that group. About a month after the attack on the World Trade Center, the New York Times printed this story. Senior Egyptian officials said that several months ago, they had given the Americans detailed warnings about the activities and inflammatory oratory of Mr. Abdel Rahman and his operation in New Jersey, and about mosques in Brooklyn through diplomatic and intelligence channels. In an interview with the New York Times, President Mubarak called on the Clinton administration to crack down on Sheikh Rahman and the Islamic group. Mr. Mubarak called on the new administration to take a more active role in stemming international terrorism, particularly activities inspired by Islamic fundamentalist groups. He blamed the current violence in Egypt and elsewhere in the Middle East, in part on Iran, and in part on veterans who fought with Afghan guerrillas as part of the American-backed war against the Soviet-backed communist government in Kabul. His remarks imply that America was taking a lackadaisical attitude towards Islamic terrorism. Now, why would that be? The most logical reason is that America controlled those groups and was using them for our own purposes, just like we did in Afghanistan. The Egyptian government was fairly explicit in its allegations about what Sheikh Rahman was doing in New York. Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman uses New York as a base, said the director of the Egyptian State Information Service. He raises funds and sends money back to Egypt with couriers. He passes on messages to his followers, giving orders about what they should do next and who they should target. We do not understand why the U.S. authorities have allowed him to enter the country. I'm sure this guy knew exactly why America allowed Sheikh Rahman to orchestrate those attacks from Brooklyn. He just didn't want to state the obvious, that America wanted the Islamic group to destabilize the Egyptian government. Had he directly accused America of trying to overthrow his government, I'm sure that America would have retaliated. Presumably, we would have told the Islamic group to increase the frequency and severity of their attacks. Not only did Egypt want America to rein in Sheikh Rahman, they also wanted us to keep him. "Oh, keep him in your country," said Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. "We don't need Abdel Rahman. You accepted him in your country, keep him." So obviously, after having Sheikh Rahman for decades, Egypt didn't want him back. They wanted us to deal with him. And now that Sheikh Rahman had his followers bomb the World Trade Center, we had the perfect excuse to jail him, which is what Egypt wanted. But would we do it? As time wore on, the Egyptian government became more explicit in its accusations against America. In July, they accused the U.S. government of providing publicity for Sheikh Rahman in order to increase his power. The high profile that the Clinton administration and the American press have given to the Sheikh and to the rest of his followers is seen by many Egyptian officials as an effort to enhance the stature of Egypt's Islamic militant movement. The mass media has turned out to be a propaganda tool for the terrorists, especially when through ignorance the terrorist crimes are overestimated and the terrorist capabilities magnified, said Al-Akram, an Egyptian newspaper. According to the New York Times, relations between the United States and Egypt, once the linchpin of American policy in the Arab world, have sharply deteriorated. Egyptian officials condemned Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman as a creation of Washington. Senior Egyptian officials, including President Mubarak, contend that the U.S. government repeatedly ignored their warnings about the dangers posed by Mr. Abdel Rahman. At one point in 1993, the Egyptian government retaliated against America. They detained 3 Americans in Egypt, and they charged them with trying to convert Muslims into Christians. Presumably, Egypt did this in an effort to pressure us into reining in Sheikh Rahman. Don't believe me that the U.S. government sided with Sheikh Rahman against the Egyptian government? Listen to this. According to the New York Times, despite the repeated warnings from Egypt, American law enforcement and intelligence officials have taken a somewhat sanguine view about the threat posed by Mr. Abdel Rahman and his followers. So while Egypt is terrified of Sheikh Rahman and his Islamic group, American intelligence is somewhat sanguine. Might it be that America is sanguine because America controls the Islamic group and is using it to attack Egypt? Not only did the U.S. government side with the Islamic group, the U.S. media also sided with the Islamic group. This is what the New York Times wrote in response to Mubarak's pleas for help. On the subject of combating international terrorism, his prescriptions ought to be taken with a large grain of desert sand. But wait, it gets better. This is what the New York Times said was the cause of the recent wave of violence in Egypt. Mr. Mubarak's inbred, bureaucratic, and unresponsive regime has lost touch with the needs and feelings of a large number of ordinary Egyptians. The Islamic insurgency, fueled by the fiery rhetoric of Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman and others, has survived repression and grown as much through government incompetence as through fundamentalist fanaticism. This is truly extraordinary. The New York Times admits that Sheikh Rahman has fueled the Islamic insurgency in Egypt. But instead of urging the U.S. government to make Sheikh Rahman stop, the Times calls the Egyptian government inbred and blames them. In case you were wondering why, after publishing all these articles, which showed the connection between Islamic extremism and the U.S. government, why didn't the New York Times realize that these terrorists were controlled by our government? Of course, the answer is, the New York Times knew damn well that our government controlled these terrorists, and they supported it. While the CIA was using the Islamic group to destroy the Egyptian economy, in an effort to further increase the pressure on the Egyptian government, the New York Times used its editorial page to attack the Egyptian government and blame it for the damage inflicted by our proxies. Still don't believe that America had the Islamic group attack Egypt? Then how do you explain the fact that U.S. diplomats met with the leaders of the Islamic group on multiple occasions? According to the New York Times, officials from the U.S. Embassy have had meetings since 1991 with militant leaders of the Islamic group. The meetings had been held at the embassy's request and centered on allegations of human rights abuses committed by the Egyptian government. Western diplomats who were aware of the contacts said the United States officials were walking a fine line between seeking to understand the goals and nature of the opposition group and refraining from any official relationship with the known terrorist organization. There are two ways of looking at these meetings. The U.S. government could have used these meetings to coordinate the attacks against the Egyptian government, though the Times article does not present any evidence of this. On the other hand, you can take the article at face value and say the American government only wanted to talk to these militants about human rights abuses of the Egyptian government. But even in that case, the U.S. government would still be encouraging those militants to attack the Egyptian government. The U.S. government was sending a message that they were concerned about human rights violations against members of the Islamic group. So the meetings were a way of saying, we sympathize with what you are going through. At a minimum, this should have encouraged the Islamic group to go after the government, and it should have scared the Egyptian government, as the meeting should have made both sides believe that the U.S. government was backing the militants. The Mubarak regime is weak, one of the militant leaders asserted, and it is our impression that the Americans are beginning to realize this. U.S. diplomats had a reason for giving the Islamic group the impression that the Egyptian government was weak. They wanted to embolden the Islamic group to challenge the regime. If they didn't want the Islamic group to attack the Egyptian government, they would have told the Islamic group that the Egyptian government was strong and that the Islamic group would not be able to defeat them. The militants say the government is corrupt and repressive, said a Western diplomat, and as long as the government ignores these charges, which are largely true, they will fail to garner much support. Not many people care if policemen get shot. Gee, I wonder what side he is on. And we did other things to coax the Islamic group into attacking Egypt. Remember, after Mahmoud Abu Halima bombed the World Trade Center, he flew to Egypt, where he was arrested. Egypt agreed to extradite Abu Halima to America. But they had one condition. The Egyptian government did not want the public to know that they extradited Abu Halima to America. For if the public knew, the Islamic group would know that the Egyptian government had extradited one of their members, and they would retaliate. So the Egyptian government demanded that the U.S. government hide their involvement in the Abu Halima extradition. But did the U.S. government live up to their end of the bargain? Hell no. After Egypt extradited Abu Halima, the U.S. government told the New York Times that Egypt remained so concerned about retaliation by Islamic fundamentalists aligned with Mr. Abu Halima's mentor, Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, that it had extracted a pledge of secrecy from American officials about the full extent of its cooperation. Of course, the fact that the New York Times printed that sentence meant the U.S. government was violating their secrecy agreement. Presumably, the U.S. government violated the secrecy agreements because they wanted to make the Islamic group angry. They wanted the Islamic group to blow something up in Egypt. So in the end, did we use the World Trade Center bombing to crack down on Sheikh Rahman? No, but we had the perfect opportunity to. When Egypt had Mahmoud Abu Halima in custody, they interrogated him. According to Egypt, during that interrogation, Abu Halima implicated the Islamic group in the attack against the World Trade Center. And with that confession, America had the perfect excuse to crack down on Sheikh Rahman and his cohorts. But did we? No. According to the New York Times, U.S. officials said the statements provided by Abu Halima during his stay in Egypt were most likely given under duress, if not torture. As such, we ignored the statement he made during his stay in Egypt. Keep in mind, at this point, the negotiations between Israel and Palestine were still ongoing. America would not crack down on Sheikh Rahman until the negotiations ended. We needed to keep the pressure on. Remember those tapes of the conversations between Imad Salem and his FBI handler? The tapes in which Salem warned the FBI of the impending attack against the World Trade Center? Presumably, the government released these tapes because they wanted to imply that the attack was orchestrated by the U.S. government, which it was. As such, Sheikh Rahman and his followers should not be blamed because they were only doing what the U.S. government told them to do. In effect, the tapes were a way of showing the Egyptian government that America would not crack down on Sheikh Rahman, at least not at this point. In addition to blaming America, the Egyptian government also blamed Iran. According to the New York Times, Mr. Mubarak had raised specific concerns about Iran's role in promoting Islamic violence against Egypt's secular government and elsewhere in the region. President Mubarak talked to us about Iran's role in establishing terrorist training camps in the Sudan that Cairo believes are being used as basis for the attacks against officials, tourists, and other targets in Egypt. U.S. government officials have said there is evidence that Iran has helped train members of those groups, both at the Sudanese camps and at others in Lebanon. In the final analysis, these groups were controlled by America. But if they have links to Iran, doesn't that imply that America has links to Iran? This just shows you that relations between America and Iran are not as adversarial as they seem. And there's one other thing. This article was published in the spring of 1993. Osama bin Laden moved to Sudan in 1992. It seems likely that the terrorist camps in Sudan that Egypt is referring to are the terrorist camps set up by Osama bin Laden. And according to this CIA document, wealthy Khartoum-based Saudi oppositionist Osama bin Laden is a regular supporter of and contributor to the Egyptian Jamaat al-Islamiyah. Jamaat al-Islamiyah is Arabic for Islamic group. So you have a situation where Iran, the U.S. government, and Osama bin Laden seem to be working together to pressure the Egyptian government. Osama bin Laden has other ties to the Islamic group and Sheikh Rahman. According to Ahmed Rashid, the two sons of Sheikh Rahman acted as mentors for Osama bin Laden. In addition to blaming America, in addition to blaming Iran, the Egyptians also blamed the Europeans and the Saudis. Egypt claimed that the Islamic group received funding from Iranian businesses and expatriates in Europe, Islamic institutions in Saudi Arabia, and the German offices of the Muslim Brotherhood. It seems like everyone was ganging up on Egypt at this point. You may be wondering, how does a person like Mahmoud Abu Halima become radicalized? In a word, torture. In Abu Halima's case, the Egyptian government tortured him brutally. This is what his lawyer said. He tells me he has cigarette burns around his genitalia, bruises on his legs. He said to me he was kept naked in a cold room about 10 days, blindfolded the whole time, beaten with wooden sticks, metal bars, hung horizontally from a metal beam, as he said, like a shish kebab. He was threatened they would kill him. Of course, Abu Halima wasn't the only person Egypt tortured. They also tortured Sheikh Rahman. According to him, Egypt subjected him to 12 kinds of torture. And that explains his hatred towards Hosni Mubarak. You may be asking yourself the following question. If torture turns people into terrorists, why do it? What was Egypt thinking? Presumably, whoever was doing the torturing was controlled by the West. Presumably, the West wanted to create a group of terrorists who wanted to overthrow the government so they could have some leverage over Egypt. Presumably, those traitors who were responsible for the torture of all those Egyptians were in the military and the intelligence agencies. Another one of the World Trade Center bombers, Ahmadinejad, was radicalized by the Israeli government. While in Palestine, he was imprisoned repeatedly and tortured for leading anti-Israeli demonstrations on the occupied West Bank. In addition to using torture, Western governments also use drugs to turn people into murderers. The government has a wide variety of drugs, which they illegally administer to unsuspecting victims. Some of these drugs make you very angry. I know because the U.S. government has at times administered these types of drugs to me. These drugs have a wide range of effects. In fact, in my experience, the effects are similar, if not identical, to the effects that anabolic steroids have. Actually, I have never used anabolic steroids, so I can't be sure that the effects are identical. But while having these drugs administered to me, in addition to becoming fairly angry, I do notice a substantial increase in my ability to exercise. My voice deepens, and my testicles do seem to shrink. These are all symptoms of anabolic steroids. If you want to see what it looks like to be on these drugs, take a look at this woman. I don't have any proof that this woman was drugged, but the government has been administering these drugs to me, and that's what it kind of looks like when you're on these drugs. You would be surprised to learn the identity of some of the people who are trying to convince Muslims to hate Jews and Christians. Emerson claims that this man, Muhammad al-Asi, is a radical preacher like Sheikh Rahman.
If the Americans are placing their forces in the Persian Gulf, we should be creating another war front for the Americans in the Muslim world, and specifically where American interests are concentrated, in Egypt, in Turkey, in the Indian subcontinent, just to mention a few. Strike against American interests there.
The important thing here is that al-Asi told his followers to attack in Egypt, Turkey, or South Asia. Despite his admonition to strike American interests, if his followers were to take his advice, you can be sure that Egyptians, Turks, or South Asians would suffer the most. Presumably, the CIA told al-Asi to tell his followers to attack Egypt, Turkey, and India because the CIA wanted to put pressure on the governments of those countries.
In the past 11 years, we've been coming here, and we cannot go into the masjid. Is this freedom? Is this what is included in the Bill of Rights?
Although I can't prove this, my hunch is that al-Asi is Jewish. Look at him. Listen to his voice. His emotion sounds completely artificial and fake. To simulate emotion, he talks loud. He sounds much less like a radical and much more like a dork. Seriously, doesn't he look and sound like the comic book guy?
I would say that the Jews have disproportionate control over the instruments of government. I would say Capitol Hill is Zionist-occupied territory. I would say the executive building, the White House, is also under a cloud of a Zionist umbrella. And so can be said about the State Department, the Pentagon, etc.
In fact, when you listen to al-Asi speak, it appears that he often has to restrain himself from bursting out into laughter. Apparently, he thinks what he is doing is funny. Presumably, he is laughing at his Muslim followers for buying into his silly con job.
We're not picking on the United States. We're not picking on anyone. We're just dealing with the people who are coming and causing us all these problems. Why is the United States placing itself in the middle of all of these problems? If it extricates itself from all of this, it will not force us to do what we are forced to do. But if it stirs a hornet's nest, the hornets are not going to respond in a lackadaisical manner.
Do you believe then in the use of violence, even as a last resort?
Yes, I believe in the use of violence. Well, wait a minute. Don't, take this issue or put words in the mouth of the interlocutor. Violence is not the word. The use of arms, I think, would be the word, the more accurate word to use here. And the Quran teaches us that sometimes the use of arms is inevitable. In order for justice to be done, this is the only recourse we have.
What about Egyptian leaders like Mubarak or Israeli leaders who come to the United States?
Right.
Since they are running their government's policies, are they legitimate targets?
No, unless the United States becomes a war front, they're not legitimate targets.
Unless the U.S. becomes a war front?
Unless the United States becomes a war front.
And at what time would it become a war front?
When do places become war fronts? When you have a war.
Is there emerging a war front condition at this point?
No, I don't think there's a war front here in the United States at this point. I think if the whole scenario continues the way it has, inevitably the United States is going to be reaching a type of war front. Yeah, but not right now.
How much longer do we have?
That's very hard to predict. I mean, if I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be somewhere else.
You may be wondering, if Al-Asi is Jewish, then why is he telling his followers to attack Israel? Furthermore, why is America supporting terrorists who attack Israel if Israel is our ally?
Mohammed Salah, a Palestinian American who was arrested in Israel in early 1993 for financing the purchase of weapons that were used to murder 4 people. He had attended secret workshops on terrorist warfare at another conference held in the Midwest in 1990.
Here's what you need to know. Israel plans on seizing all of Palestine, and they use Palestinian terrorism as an excuse to do it. When a terrorist attacks them, they use that as an excuse to seize more land. And they use terrorism as an excuse to avoid negotiating with the Palestinians. We did not crack down on the Brooklyn terrorist network until a few months after the World Trade Center bombing. At that point, those terrorists were planning to detonate powerful car bombs at the United Nations headquarters in New York, the Lincoln and Holland tunnels, 26 Federal Plaza, an office building in Lower Manhattan that houses the FBI, and other strategic targets. The terrorists also wanted to conduct a series of assassinations. Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali of the United Nations and President Hosni Mubarak of Egypt were on the group's hit list, as were Senator Alphonse D'Amato and a New York State Assemblyman. In this case, many of the terrorists who were going to participate in the attack came from Sudan, where Osama bin Laden was living. 5 of the suspects were born in the Sudan. 6 of them worshipped at the mosque of Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman. The Sudan has emerged as a principal transit point for Egyptian and Algerian veterans of the war with Afghanistan who want to return home to join domestic Islamic fundamentalist movements. It was through Sudan, too, that Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman made his way to the United States in 1990, granted a visa in the American Embassy in Khartoum. The ringleader of the group, Sadiq Ibrahim Sadiq Ali, was the personal interpreter of Mr. Abdel Rahman. Sadiq Ali said he was entrapped by Mr. Salem. Remember, Imad Salem was the FBI informer who had infiltrated the group. Sadiq Ali may be right. After creating all these terrorists for the war in Afghanistan, the CIA may have wanted to dispose of them. Having them try to blow up the UN and arresting them before they could carry out the attack would definitely do the trick. Finally, on July 2nd, about a week after the government arrested the terrorists involved in the latest plot, Janet Reno ordered the arrest of Sheikh Rahman. But America would not indict him until over a month later. In fact, after detaining Sheikh Rahman, we immediately threatened to release him unless the Egyptian government offered to take custody of him. State Department officials said that under American law, Mr. Abdel Rahman, who was appealing an expulsion order, could leave and seek refuge in a third country that would support his militant goals, including the overthrow of the Egyptian government. Rahman had the option of leaving the country, because the American authorities detained him on immigration charges, instead of charging him with a crime. The only way to counter such a departure, American officials said, was a formal extradition request by the Egyptian government. This, of course, made Egypt angry. They wanted America to deal with Sheikh Rahman. They had Sheikh Rahman once before, and that didn't turn out so well. They were hoping that we would dispose of the Sheikh ourselves. 2 months later, we finally did. 2 months after she turned down recommendations to charge Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman as a terrorist, Attorney General Janet Reno reversed herself and approved an indictment. The U.S. government charged Sheikh Rahman with complicity in a conspiracy, beginning with the shooting death of Rabbi Meir Kahane in 1989, and continuing through the World Trade Center bombing in February, and the bombing and assassination plot uncovered in June. The decision to indict him was made on Monday in a closed-door meeting of the Justice Department's top brass. As you can see, the story was published on August 26th. So if the Justice Department decided to indict Sheikh Rahman on Monday, that means they made their decision on August 23rd. Notice that the Justice Department indicted Rahman for the death of Meir Kahane, which means that they should have indicted him 3 years earlier in 1990. But they waited until August 23rd, 1993. Why did they do that? Israel and Palestine completed the negotiation for the Oslo Accords on August 20th. America decided to indict Sheikh Rahman only 3 days later. This is not a coincidence. Disposing of Sheikh Rahman was America's way of rewarding Egypt for its role in the negotiations. So after Egypt helped create the Oslo Accords, America had to uphold its end of the bargain and get rid of Sheikh Rahman. Of course, the Oslo Accords were meaningless. None of the key issues were decided in the agreement. The key issues are defining the borders of Palestine, defining the status of Jerusalem, and dealing with the Palestinian refugees. The reason why the agreement solved none of those key issues is because America and Europe have always wanted the Middle East to be at war with itself. Resolving those key issues would do much to end that war. To prevent that from happening, America had the Islamic group blow up things in Egypt to make sure that Egypt would offer its consent to an agreement that resolved none of the key issues. Of course, the other reason why there is no peace agreement is because Israel wants to seize the rest of Palestine. By not resolving the borders issue, that allows Israel to continue to seize Palestinian territory. This will not stand. On February 6, 2011, Bill O'Reilly interviewed Obama before the Super Bowl. At the start of the interview, the two talked about the revolution in Egypt. O'Reilly seemed to be worried that if America took a hard line against President Mubarak, that bad things might happen.
And the other problem is Mubarak knows a lot of bad things about the United States. I'm sure you're aware of that. So I'm just worried that he might go off the reservation.
O'Reilly seemed to be worried that Mubarak might tell the world the truth about al-Qaeda, depending on how America approached the situation in Egypt. The amazing thing is that O'Reilly seems to know about all the bad things America has done in Egypt, but yet he is willing to keep this information secret. That makes him an accomplice and a criminal. And neither he, nor Obama, nor his staff, nor the military, nor the CIA, nor academia, nor the rest of the media will escape unpunished. History ends here. O'Reilly had a good reason for fearing that Mubarak might go off the reservation. In fact, he's done it before, sort of. After the World Trade Center bombing, during an interview with an Egyptian newspaper, he said the following about Omar Abdel Rahman. The Sheikh has been an agent of the American intelligence apparatus since the days of Afghanistan. He went to Peshawar and spoke about holy war. He gets a continuing salary, and the visa which he obtained was not issued by mistake. It was because he had performed specific services. Presumably, Mubarak said these things to pressure America. Mubarak must have gotten whatever he wanted, because a few days later, the newspaper printed a retraction, saying that Mubarak did not say those things. Of course, in reality, I bet you anything that Mubarak did say those things, and that he said those things to pressure America. I bet you he anticipated that America would cave into his demands, and he would have the newspaper issue a retraction a few days later. So how did America prevent Mubarak from spilling the beans after his arrest? Apparently our intelligence agencies have ways of disposing of people who know too much. After losing power, Mubarak acquired a mysterious illness, which made him bedridden. Egypt had to put him in bed, in a cage, at the courtroom in order for him to attend his trial. So now he's probably one of two things. He's either too scared to tell the truth, or too drugged to remember what the truth is. This will not stand.